Psalm 102, verses 12 through 17. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. Your name endures to all generations. You will rise up and have compassion on Zion, for it is time to favor it. The appointed time has come, for your servants hold its stones dear and have pity on its dust. The nations will fear the name of the Lord, and all the kings of the earth your glory. For the Lord will build up Zion, he will appear in his glory. He will regard the prayer of the destitute, and will not despise their prayer. Mark 13, 1 through 8, 24 through 37. As he came out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left up here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still not come. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn. Or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake." This is the end of the reading.
Well, good morning, and welcome to our digital message for Journey Christian Church. This is for Sunday, March 29th, the fifth Sunday of Lent, and we are using Mark chapter 13 as our main lesson for today. You know, for all the news surrounding the pandemic, it occurred to me the other day that I haven't heard yet anyone proclaim how this worldwide virus is God's punishment for all our sinful ways. And these are indeed the end times, the apocalypse, the rapture, the beginning of great trials and tribulations. There's all kinds of names for it. Now that may yet happen. Someone may yet announce that the end times are here and they have proof. Now if that happens, or even if it doesn't, it still raises a very good question. How do we know that something is or isn't the end times or the coming of Christ? You know, as Christians, we proclaim that Christ will come again. And even if we don't know when this will happen, it raises the question, are we supposed to know what it will look like? Well, today's gospel lesson from Mark 13, the disciples and Jesus are talking about this very subject. Now, here's the setting for the conversation. Jesus and the disciples are in Jerusalem now for the last time The religious leaders are already maneuvering for Jesus to be arrested. And in the previous chapter, they spent the day at the temple as Jesus taught. And we know that many of those teachings were met with resistance and arguments, and some people left grumbling, mostly religious leaders. Now, as chapter 13 opens, the group is leaving the temple, and one of the disciples tells Jesus that he is really impressed with the temple. And the temple was a magnificent piece of architecture. It was impressive. There was much to admire. And Jesus answers this by stating that it will all become rubble, and there won't be one stone left upon another. Now, we can appreciate that this is frightening, disturbing news to hear. And the disciples, upon hearing it, they begin to wonder, is Jesus saying that he is getting ready to make his move? Is the time to overthrow Rome at hand? And if so, then we want to be ready for it. So, understandably, some of the disciples pull Jesus aside so that they can have his undivided attention, and they want the insider information in order to be prepared. When will this happen? What should we watch for? Now, these are good questions, and they want to be ready, and that's good. And the first thing that Jesus tells them is don't be deceived. And he tells them that people will come forward and deceive by claiming to be the Messiah. So he tells them to kind of be on the alert for that. But then he tells them something extremely helpful. He says, when you do hear talk about wars and disasters, both natural and man-made, and you find yourself fearful and scared and losing your head, then you know it isn't me, says Jesus. He says, I don't work that way, and neither does God. If you hear talk about you better get ready or you will miss out on salvation, then you will know that isn't me. Everything I have taught you about God is that salvation is a free gift of grace, unearned yet given. Jesus continues saying, I don't bring fear. I don't bring panic and trepidation or cowering before me. The end time is not to be feared, but welcomed. And he goes on to say that the nature of God is life and joy and wholeness, not fear, death, and despair. You know, when we look back over the chapters preceding this one, we see that everything Jesus teaches about God reveals this. Jesus teaches and shows how God brings justice, mercy, forgiveness, welcome, opportunity for transformation, and to be an integral part of God's work in the world. And yet he says nothing about fear and trepidation. Jesus then tells his disciples exactly what they need to watch for. Now, unfortunately, the disciples still find it hard to interpret what Jesus is saying. And that is no slight on them. We all struggle to understand what Jesus is saying. They think he is talking about some future time yet to come, but he is actually revealing the details of what will happen in the next few days. And he does it with a parable. And he tells the parable of the man who takes a trip, leaves his home, and leaves his servants in charge. And that parable is about Jesus and the disciples, and by extension, us. In the parable, Jesus mentions 4 possible times for the master to show up. He talks about evening, midnight, cockcrow, and dawn. Now, all 4 of those times match the hours of his trial, betrayal, and conviction that is about to happen. Listen to this. He mentions about at evening. Well, it was at evening that Jesus and the disciples gather for the Passover meal, and Jesus reveals that one will betray him. It is at midnight, after the meal, when they are in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus takes 3 disciples with them and says to them, "Stay awake and pray with me." And all 3 times he goes back to them, he finds that they have fallen asleep. And it is also at midnight that Jesus is betrayed and arrested. And the 3rd time we have mentioned is at cockcrow. And this, of course, is when Peter realizes that he has now denied Jesus 3 times, as Jesus predicted. And then the final time we have mentioned is at dawn. And it is at dawn that the chief priests and the scribes bring Jesus before Pilate, and he stands utterly alone and is soon convicted and condemned. Now, the disciples may have missed what Jesus was saying, but we know that this parable also speaks to us. We as disciples are to stay awake and keep watch, not for the Master to return, not for the end times, but we are to stay awake and keep watch for God's work in the world right now in front of us. Look around you. Where do you see justice being done? That is God and God's people at work right now. Name it and praise it. Where do you see injustice? Perhaps that is where God is calling you to serve. But name the injustice and do what you can to stand opposed to it. Where do you see God's will being denied? I think you can rightly ask, well, what is God's will? Well, God's will is that all of creation can reach its full God-given potential. Now, if you see that being denied to anyone, anywhere, in any way, then perhaps that is where God is calling you to serve, to watch and to look and to name the injustices and to bring about justice in God's name. And so as disciples, we watch and we look for where God's blessings are happening, and we praise and support that. And we watch and we look, and we need to be aware of how our current systems and laws cause people to be marginalized, and we must speak against it. Now, maybe you're not an advocate that can speak to the officials in Olympia, but you can contact a senator and let your opinion be known. You can sign referendums that support equity and wholeness for all people, and you can vote for candidates that work for justice and equity. This is what it means to be awake and to watch and to look for the presence of God. Now, Jesus gives us a great assurance about his coming again. Actually, he gives us 2 great assurances about his coming again. One is that he will come again, and we need not fear that, but look forward to it. And the second is that no one will miss it. Listen to what he says in verses 26 and 27. "And then they'll see the Son of Man enter in grand style, his arrival filling the sky. No one will miss it. He'll dispatch the angels. They will pull in the chosen from the 4 winds, from pole to pole." So don't fret or focus on the end times. Instead, spend your time and give your energies in service to God and others. And fear not. Amen, and may the Lord continue to bless you and keep you, and may you stay healthy. And I do look forward to that time when we can worship in community with one another again. God's blessings on your week.